In 1901, 3 railroads controlled the movement of freight and passengers across the American Northwest: the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. Together, they held a near-total grip on transportation from the Great Lakes to the Pacific. These 3 networks formed the longest line of commercial integration in North America. They stretched from the hubs of Chicago to the ports of Puget Sound. By the end of the year, they would operate as a single entity. J.P. Morgan was the architect of this consolidation. In November 1901, he announced the formation of the Northern Securities Company. This new corporation would absorb and hold the controlling stock of all 3 competing railroads, centralizing their power under his direction. Morgan structured Northern Securities as a holding company, a legal shell designed for the sole purpose of owning the shares of other corporations. The Certificate of Incorporation authorized a capital stock of $400 million. At the time, it was the second largest corporate transaction in history. Morgan's lawyers believed the 1895 Knight Sugar decision made this structure legally secure. In that case, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not regulate local property ownership under the Sherman Antitrust Act. By organizing Northern Securities in New Jersey, a state with highly permissive corporate laws, Morgan assumed the federal government had no authority to interference. That assumption was tested in early 1902. Theodore Roosevelt, sworn in just months earlier following the assassination of William McKinley, instructed his Attorney General to file a federal lawsuit to dismantle Morgan's holding company. Attorney General Philander Knox alleged that the merger violated Section 1 of the Sherman Act. The government argued that by combining 3 competing railroads into a single ownership group, Morgan had created an illegal restraint of trade that destroyed the motive for competition. Morgan traveled to the White House in February to settle the matter privately. He told Roosevelt, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." The president refused. The 2 men held conflicting worldviews. Morgan saw a private property dispute to be negotiated between peers. Roosevelt saw a direct challenge to the authority of the United States government. The case would decide whether the law applied to the nation's largest concentrations of capital. For 14 years, the Knight Sugar decision neutralized federal antitrust efforts. As this historical analysis shows, the court established a rigid distinction between manufacturing and trade. Ownership of property was a local state matter, placing it beyond the reach of federal commerce laws. Previous victories, like the Trans-Missouri decision, had targeted active rate-fixing agreements. Northern Securities was different. It simply held paper. The case asked whether the federal government could regulate share ownership in a state-chartered corporation. The defense argued the 14th Amendment protected Morgan's right to acquire property. This study of early antitrust law notes how freedom of contract was used as a primary defense. They contended government dictates on owning railroad stock violated the constitutional liberty of private contract. The dispute moved beyond railroad lines into a test of whether a state-issued corporate charter could override federal commerce laws. If Morgan won, any monopoly could insulate itself simply by organizing as a holding company. In April 1903, the government won in the Federal Circuit Court. Point 3 ruled transferring competing railroad stock to holding companies violated the Sherman Act. Panning to Point 5, the court rejected the state shield defense. The charter offered no protection. The lower court's decision rejected the state shield defense, leaving the Supreme Court as the final resort for Morgan's lawyers. On March 14, 1904, the Supreme Court issued its ruling. The decision was split 5-4. By a single vote, the court ordered the dissolution of the largest combination of capital in American history. Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote the majority opinion. He argued that the mere act of combining competing railroads was enough to restrict free competition, regardless of whether the company had actually raised rates yet. This page from the Supreme Court Reporter documents Harlan's conclusion. He held that a combination designed to restrain trade among the states is an exercise of the power granted to Congress to regulate commerce. In his view, a corporate structure could not be used to shield property ownership if that ownership effectively destroyed competition. Justice Edward Douglas White led the dissent. He argued that acquiring stock is an act of property ownership, separate from the act of commerce. He warned that if the government could regulate who owns property, its power would become limitless. The case also produced a famous dissent from Roosevelt's own appointee, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. Holmes argued for a strict textual reading of the law. He warned that the court was giving the Sherman Act a new meaning invented for the purposes of this act. He believed the law was meant to stop specific contracts that would strain trade, not the mere fusion of two companies. Holmes concluded with a warning about judicial power. "I am not concerned with the wisdom of such an attempt, but I believe that Congress was not entrusted by the Constitution with the power to make it." Roosevelt was reportedly furious with the dissent, but the majority ruling stood. The Northern Securities Company was broken up, and its shares were returned to the original stockholders. The decision established that the Sherman Act could indeed dismantle the largest concentrations of private capital. Standard Oil and other trusts would soon face the same legal gauntlet. Yet Holmes's dissent left a question that remains at the center of antitrust enforcement. Does the law punish a company for its size or only for its conduct?